Hi guys, thanks for stopping by at Twisted Art Designs. I think that I should call this video So Many Inks, So Little Time. I just thought I would do a tutorial to show and talk about all the different types of mixed media and crafting, paper crafting inks that are on the market, and how do you use each one. It can be really confusing. So you see an ink, you like the color, you buy it, you bring it home, but you're not quite sure, what am I supposed to do with this ink? What is this ink for? How can I use it to my benefit? And you're probably wondering, okay, well, how does she know what to do with all these inks? I used to work at a scrapbooking card making store several years back, and I taught classes, and so I learned about all the different inks. I was blessed at that time to be able to take a lot of classes from a lot of the manufacturers. They would put on little hands-on training classes for the store managers to be able to show their product, show how to use them. So I did learn a lot of interesting techniques and how to use these different inks. So I thought I would impart my wisdom that I learned, so maybe it'll help you. So when you're doing your project, you'll know which is the right ink to do for which project you're working on. So let's get started, and I'll just start explaining all these inks. Let's start with the very basics. Basics would be a dye ink. There are many, many different brands of inks from all different companies. So when you go to your local craft store, or if you don't have a craft store and you're purchasing online, what you want to look for a paper crafting ink is the word dye. A dye ink is an ink that you would use for primarily paper crafting. You can rubber stamp with it with a rubber stamp and stamp your image. It dries really quickly, and when it dries completely, it doesn't smear. And so you can use it on cardstock and different kinds of paper for card making and all your different projects. But a dye ink is not something that you would emboss. It's only for stamping. So dye is a drier ink. I don't mean dry as in the ink pad is dry. I mean dry as in you stamp it, it dries really quickly, and then that's it. That's all you have to do. You do not have to heat set dye ink. So when you're looking for just a stamped image, you want to just stamp an image, you want to look for a dye ink. Okay, and there's, like I said, there's lots of different brands. Ranger is the most popular one right now, I would say, on the market, and Ranger Archival ink it's going to say right on it that it's acid free and that it's a permanent dye ink. So permanent meaning when you stamp it and it dries, it's not going to smear. It's permanent dye ink. So that's the difference. Dye, you do not have to heat set. Okay? And like I said, there's lots of different brands, so you just look for the word dye on any of your ink pads. And they come in a variety of colors, so you can find them in, this is a brown, so you can find them in colors. There's brown, there's black, there's green, there's coffee colored. So if you can get the color of ink that you want, you just have to look for it and look for it to say dye if you don't want to heat set it. Okay? StazOn ink. StazOn is a solvent ink. Solvent ink can be used to stamp on anything. So you can stamp an image on metal, glass, even some plastics, wood. You can also use it on paper, cardboard, chipboard, cardstock, anything you want to stamp with. But if you're looking for something, say you're working on an altered book and you have a piece of metal and you want to stamp something on it to make some interesting an interesting pattern, and you want to stamp, you'd have to use a StazOn ink. It's a solvent ink. With a solvent ink, you have to be really careful with your rubber stamp. If you use StazOn and you stamp your image, there is a cleaner that is specifically for StazOn ink. You need to get the StazOn ink stamp cleaner, and as soon as you're done, you want to be sure that you clean off that rubber of your rubber stamp with the StazOn solvent cleaner. Because it's a solvent, it will eat that rubber and it'll make the rubber of your rubber stamp just hard as a rock. I just showed another video where I was using a stamp that is a fleur-de-lis, and it wasn't my stamp, it was someone else's stamp, and they didn't care for the stamp properly, and so the rubber on it was really, really hard. So when you go to try to stamp your image, you don't get a good, crisp, clean image because that rubber has been mistreated and now it's hard as a rock. So if you use StazOn on your rubber stamps or on your clear stamps that you get, you know, your cling clear stamps now are the popular thing, not wood mounted. You want to be sure that you get some StazOn solvent stamp cleaner and clean that stamp really well so that it preserves the rubber of your stamp. You can also use StazOn cleaner for if you stamped on something like glass or metal and you don't like how it turned out, you can wipe it away and do it again. Once you ink with StazOn, it pretty much stays put, and it does not have to be heat set, so you don't heat set this one, you just stamp and go. But it's a solvent ink, so it is going to be it is going to stick to other things like metal and wood and glass. So this is what you'd want to use. You can't use a dye ink. If you use a dye ink on glass or metal, when the ink dries and then you go back to touch that thing, it's going to just smear and come right back off again. This ink is not what you would use. If you want on metal or wood or glass or whatever, you would have to use StazOn because it's a solvent ink. So it's very, it's almost got like a sticky feel to it. So when you stamp on it, it's sticky, but then when it dries, it's very permanent. So that's what you would use StazOn ink for. Most of us know what Ranger Distress ink by Tim Holtz is. Distress ink is, it is a dye ink. It is, actually, does it say on it that it's dye? Yes, it does say dye. Okay, it is a dye ink. The Distress inks are a little bit different from like the Ranger archival inks. The difference is this is very, very pigmented. So when you stamp with it, it's going to be like black is going to turn out just solid black. If you stamped with a Distress ink, it's not going to be a solid color because Distress ink is more translucent. You can see through it. It's made a little bit thinner so that you can use it for, you can smear it with your finger. You can use a tool for adding colors and things around the edge of like this. So I could take my finger in my Tim Holtz ink and go around the edge of this, and it just adds a little bit of almost like shading. You can use a tool. I'm just using a cosmetic sponge. There's a tool with a handle that I have. I just don't have it near me to grab. So you can use Distress ink to add some color and interest. But as you can see, it's not solid. It is transparent in a way. You can build it up and get it darker and darker. Sorry about my dog barking. You can build it up and get it darker and darker, but it is a little bit transparent, and that's why it's a Distress ink. It's mainly for distressing. You can stamp with it, but your image is going to be a little bit transparent and see-through. If you stamp with this dye ink, your image is going to be nice and solid and crisp. So hopefully that'll explain the difference between the two. They're both dye ink, so they don't have to be heat set, but this one is a little transparent and this one is more pigmented. Okay, then there is Pigment ink. Color Box is a pigment ink. Encore is a pigment ink. That's a dye. Memento is a pigment ink, and the difference with that, a pigment ink is a very, very wet ink. Pigment ink has to be heat set. Pigment ink is used with embossing powders for embossing with a heat tool. A pigment ink is going to stay wet until you heat set it. So you could take a rubber stamp with your pigment ink And you could stamp your image onto paper, onto cardstock, onto whatever you want. And if you don't want to put embossing powder over the top of it and heat set it and do an embossing technique, this is fine. Pigment ink is fine for stamping with, but you still have to heat set that ink. So no matter what, you're going to have to use heat. You put the pigment ink on your stamp, you stamp it, and then you're going to have to use your heat tool to heat it. Otherwise, what's going to happen is that ink, you can leave it sitting there for 24 to 48 hours and eventually it might dry, but it is still going to smear. It's going to smear when you touch it. So you want to heat set anything that is a pigment ink. The pigmented inks were primarily made for doing embossing. They were designed for putting embossing powder over the top of the ink. It's very thick and it's very kind of tacky. It's got a little tacky of a feel to it, and that's so that embossing powders will collect on top of the ink on your stamped image, and then when you heat set it, they melt into the image, and then it creates an embossed feel when it's cooled. So if you're going to use a pigment ink, if that's all you have, say you have you bought a black stamp pad and you're all excited and you come home and you've never used inks before, and you don't have a heat tool, and all you want to do is just stamp with it, you're going to be discouraged because you're going to stamp with it and you're going to say, why isn't this drying? Why is it smeary? What is wrong with this ink? If it says pigment on it, it does have to be heat set. So keep that in mind. Dye ink dry, pigment ink wet. The only way I remember that when I was first learning about it is pigment ink. To me, I try to tell myself, okay, it has a lot of pigment in it, so it's going to stay wet. Dye dry, dye dry, they sound the same. So when you're out buying your ink pads, if you're at the store and you see a clearance bin, and you're like, oh, look at all these ink pads, be sure you're reading on the back, what kind of ink is this? Is it a solvent ink? Is it a dye ink? Is it a pigment ink? If it doesn't give you directions on how to use the product, those words will be your key to how to use those inks. So remember, pigment ink has to be heat set. It can be heat set by itself, or it can be embossed over with embossing powder. So you can put a fine embossing powder, and I should get into that in a different video, but embossing powders come in like an ultra thick, which is really, really big grains of embossing powder. So when you put that on, it's going to melt and it's going to be a lot thicker and a lot, I don't know, a lot more of a gloss to it. But a fine embossing powder is really, it's almost like baby powder. It's really, really fine, and it'll adhere to a very delicate, intricate stamp that has a lot of filigree and a lot of little tiny lines. And so if you're stamping something that has a very, very tiny intricate pattern and you want to emboss with it, be sure that your embossing powder is a fine or ultra fine embossing powder. That way it'll get into all the little tiny lines that you stamp, and when you heat set it and it melts and it makes the embossing, it will be a nice, crisp, clean image. Okay, so pigment inks, color box pigment inks, like this is a white. They come in all different colors. All inks come in really a great variety of colors so that you have a lot to use and a lot to choose from. Like this one is white. So the benefit of having a white one would be if you're using a dark cardstock or a dark background and maybe in an altered book and you're stamping something, if you use a white that's solid like this, it's a pigment ink, and then you put clear embossing powder over that and you heat set it, it's going to be nice and white, and the embossing powder is going to make it, the raised image, shiny. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. So that is pigment ink. So you be sure that you heat set pigment ink. Here's another brand, Encore. Here's a metallic one. They come in metallics that are silver, gold, copper. They're absolutely beautiful, beautiful inks. See if you can see that. They're gorgeous. And they look metallic. That's what they're supposed to be. So they look like metal, like copper, silver, gold. So when you stamp with it, you could put a colored embossing powder like a gold over gold, But with this ink pad, you don't need to buy gold embossing powder. If you just buy clear, then you can use this kind of an ink pad and clear embossing powder over it, and it's going to look really vibrant and gold and shiny. Okay, so that's the other thing too about embossing. Whatever your ink base is, it's not necessarily going to show if you have a colored embossing powder over it. Whatever the color of ink is, if you're using clear embossing powder over it, the color of ink will show through. So kind of common sense, but just a little tip. So those are pigments, pigment inks. Be sure you heat set them. Hybrid ink. This is a hybrid. I don't know that you see this a lot, but hybrid just basically means it's kind of, it says it's all-purpose. It's kind of on the same, it says that it's a pigment, but it dries like a dye. So what it means is a hybrid ink is you can use a hybrid ink both ways. You can use it to stamp with, and it'll dry by itself like a dye ink does, where you don't have to heat set it. But it's tacky enough that it will take embossing powder, and then you can emboss over it as well. So either way, if it says hybrid, it's both. It's kind of a pigment that dries to a dye ink, which is a little bit confusing, but if you see the word hybrid, that's what they mean. And this one even says it right on it. It says that it's colors that are like a pigment ink but dry like a dye ink, so it's all purpose. So it can be used on surfaces, like it says. Use your heat if you're going to set it on glass, fabric, wood, plastic, metal, and clay. If you're going to use it on paper, it'll dry like it's a dye ink on paper. So if you're going to use it like you would a StazOn ink, so to speak. You can use it on those things and heat set it. But the thing that I like about this versus StazOn is very, it's very sticky, and it's very what I would call caustic, so it's very harsh. And a hybrid ink it's less strong smelling, it's not as sticky feeling, but yet you still can use it to stamp on wood and metal and things like that. So that's hybrid ink. And then there are inks that are chalk inks. Here's a VersaMagic. Here is Colorbox. The difference in this, if you see an ink and it says chalk ink, it's pigmented as well, so you do have to heat set this. You could stamp with it and heat set it. You could stamp with it and put embossing powder over it and heat set it, but it does have to be heat set. But the difference is, if it says chalk ink, is when it dries to a chalky looking finish. So if you were to stamp this green one, this is really pretty green. If you were to stamp this pretty green one on a leaf, rubber stamp, and put that down and then use your heat tool to dry it, the look and the feel of it is going to feel like chalk. So it's a pigment ink and it's going to look like chalk. If you use a pigment ink like a regular color box and you stamp that same leaf and you heat set it, it's going to look solid green. It's not going to have a chalky feel on top of it. So a chalk ink just means that it's going to have a chalky looking finish to it. So if it says the word chalk, be careful in that too, because you may be buying an ink pad. Oh, here's a black ink pad, and you grab it and you think, oh, this is great, I'm going to take this home. You stamp with it, you heat set it, and then you're like, why is it not solid, crisp black? Why does this look so weird? It looks kind of milky, kind of chalky, but it's because it has the word chalk. It's a chalk ink. So be careful with that. If that's what you're looking for, and that's the result that you want, is for it to look like chalk on your paper, then you look for the word chalk. If you don't want that, and you just want a crisp black image or solid image, be sure you're not buying a chalk ink. But again, pigment, what do we do with pigment? We heat set it. Dye, dry, pigment, heat set. Okay? Ranger also makes, or a lot of companies do, but Ranger makes a clear ink. Clear embossing ink. So the ink pad has no color to it at all. The ink in this pad has no color. So when you take your stamp and you stamp onto this ink, you need to look at your stamp and make sure that it looks shiny everywhere, that you got the ink everywhere on the stamp. You stamp with it on your paper and you put a colored embossing powder over it, and then when it heat sets, it comes to life and you'll be able to see that image. It's a clear ink, so it doesn't matter what color of embossing powder you're using over it, but you use colors more than anything. You can also use clear embossing powder over clear ink, and in fact that last video I showed a demonstration of that in an altered book. There was a postage stamp and I used a stipple brush with this ink over that postage stamp, add some ultra thick clear embossing powder, heated it up, and it just made a really neat textured image over that postage stamp and kind of brought it to life. And that is clear ink, so you could do all kinds of neat clear techniques and textures over what you're doing with this, either with a rubber stamp for an image or with a brush to add in some texture in places. So that's what you would use clear ink for. And it's pigment. It is a pigment ink, even though it's clear. Pigment heat set, so this one has to be heat set. Okay, so hopefully that gave you some idea of all these inks. Oh my gosh, what are all these inks? Or, you know, maybe you went to a thrift sale or a yard sale or something like that, and you found a great big box of someone getting rid of all these different inks. Oh, I gotta buy these inks. Then you get them home and you don't know what to do. Hopefully this gave you some ideas for how to use these different inks. And always, always, always clean your rubber stamps. That is so important, to clean your stamps. In fact, I should do a quick video on how to clean, the best ways to clean your rubber stamps, because if you don't take care of your stamps, they are not going to take care of you. They will dry out, the rubber will get hard. If they're the clear mounted ones, you know, the new cling clear ones that you see everywhere, and you don't take care of them, they're going to disintegrate and fall apart. They're going to get sticky and gummy. So when you use inks on your stamps or on a brush, if you're using a stipple brush or a paint brush to apply ink, be sure to wash your tools so that they will stay happy and healthy and you can continue creating. So hopefully this was a quick, nice video that gave you some ideas on how to use different inks. And as always, if you have questions or have a specific ink that you bought, you don't know what to do with it, if it's something I haven't mentioned here, or maybe a brand, or just you need an advice on technique for that specific ink, hit me up in the comments below. I'm always glad to help. So hopefully this was informative and that you are going to sit down and make some art today, because art soothes the heart. So thanks for stopping by. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. Have a great day.